Hey everybody, I'm Zach.
And I'm Jesse.
You're watching Tesla Time News.
Episode 460.
On Now You Know.
This is a special TTN this week. We've got our friend Eric Berger in. He is a space journalist, and he kind of broke the story about the Starliner. And we're going to get into it right after this.
Thanks to Novium for sponsoring this episode.
Check out these cool pens inspired by spacecraft.
Hover pens float on their docks using permanent magnets and are each made of aircraft-grade aluminum.
The hover pens are not just stylish, they're refillable and are comfortable to write with.
Now, a while back, I bought one for my dad and one for Jesse for Christmas. I thought they looked great and are such an amazing conversation starter.
So whether you're a science or space enthusiast or simply someone who enjoys having beautiful objects, the hover pen is the ultimate gift idea.
It comes beautifully packaged and it reinforces what an amazing gift the hover pen can be.
We have the Hover Pen Interstellar, a ballpoint pen standing on its base at a 23.5 degree angle. It's actually a nod to the Earth's axial tilt. It received the Time Award for one of the best inventions of 2022.
And there's also a premium version featuring an authentic meteorite shard embedded in its tip. The meteorite is older than the Earth itself.
We also have a Hover Pen Future. This one is for those of you who prefer a fountain pen or a rollerball pen.
And the Hover Pen Future has an even more futuristic look with interchangeable tips and a 60-degree angle.
Hover Pen would make an amazing gift for yourself or anyone.
Use our code NYK or hit the link in the description to get 10% off all hover pens. Free international shipping available for most countries, including North America, the UK, Australia, and Europe.
Thanks to Novium for sponsoring this episode. We're so fortunate to have Eric Berger with us today. Eric, before I even let you say hello, I want to just start off by saying thank you. Thank you so much for doing all the work that you do. Thank you for your books and for your news coverage of everything space and SpaceX. And in this case, what I want to talk to you the most about was Boeing Starliner. I'll let you say hello.
Hello.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about Starliner and your coverage of it. I feel like it's so important. First, just because you probably know more about it than either of us do, talk to us a little bit about like what happened with Starliner, mainly, the trip up. Obviously, everyone wanted to focus on, that the astronauts couldn't get home. They're finally home. What was their experience on the way up?
Well, we didn't really know much about it, to be honest, because the astronauts, Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams, or colloquial Butch and Sonny, as everyone I think knows them, didn't really speak publicly that much about the flight up, before they got to space station. Remember, this is last June, so almost a full year ago. And this was the first human test flight on the Starliner spacecraft built by Boeing to carry NASA astronauts to and from the space station. As they went up, they had some issues, various issues with leaks and things like that. But the major problem was as they were getting closer to the space station, some of the thrusters on the spacecraft failed. And ultimately, the spacecraft docked. And I think what we didn't really know is what the perception of that whole experience was like inside the spacecraft.
I mean, I think for a lot of people, we hear like thrusters going down, and most of us aren't astronauts or indeed, astrophysicists or, that into space. We've never really piloted a spacecraft unless, like me, you've played a lot of Kerbal Space Program. So, of course, I think I always think of myself as an expert. But how many thrusters went down and what did that mean for the astronauts on board?
So the Starliner has two major propulsion systems. One is the kind of the main engine that provides the bulk of the thrust. And then the other is the reaction control system thrusters. There are about 28 of these. They're much smaller. They're arranged in 4 pods around the side of the spacecraft service module. And as the spacecraft was going up toward the space station, 1 failed, 2 failed, and ultimately 5 of the 28 failed.
And I mean, 5 out of 28, it seems like you have, you got 23 left, right? So big deal. Was it a big deal?
So we didn't know. That was really kind of what you wanted to understand, because if like 5 of your thrusters that help you point in one direction failed, then that's a huge deal, right? You start to lose control of the spacecraft. But if there are 5 sort of separated around the spacecraft and there's redundancy, then it's less of an issue.
And so back, in June when this all happened, all I remember hearing in the news was, there was
hydrogen leak.
There's a hydrogen leak. little bit of trouble. NASA's going to look into it. They're going to decide whether or not
big deal.
they're going to fly back because they're supposed to be an 8-day mission. Then they were like, okay, well, we're going to keep testing it. The astronauts are going to stay up there. They love space. They're astronauts. So, of course, they're going to, they love it. They're having a great time. And then it eventually was like, okay, we're not going to have it crewed on the way back. And it did come back. But what was known about what was going on back in June?
So I'm definitely not an insider, right? I'm a reporter. I'm on the outside, but it seemed pretty clear early on that the hydrogen leaks, as you discussed, were a problem, but they always had ample reserves. It did not sound like that was going to be a showstopper in terms of getting to the space station safely or even coming back. And it was a concern. You never want leaks on your spacecraft, but they had plenty of reserve, and it seemed like that they were going to have plenty to sort of operate their propulsion system. It really seemed like the thruster failure was the bigger problem because it sounded even from the beginning like they didn't have a real good handle on why these thrusters had failed. And the other really concerning thing for me early on was the fact that thrusters had also failed on the previous flight. So this was a test flight without people that had taken place a couple of years earlier, and NASA and Boeing had thought they'd solved that problem. Well, clearly they hadn't. And so that opened up a bigger can of worms. It's like, well, why, if NASA didn't fully resolve the problem, were they putting humans on board the vehicle? But again, we really didn't have a sense of how much danger Butch and Sonny were in during that flight up to the space station. The other thing that as a reporter, you were really following closely last year was, will they bring Starliner back with people on board, or will they decide to have this really sort of dramatic notion of a rescue mission, where you would fly a Crew Dragon up there and Butch and Sonny would come home on that spacecraft eventually. And so that was really, even beyond the thruster issues, that was the story I was following most closely last summer, and had some pretty good intelligence that NASA was working very closely with SpaceX on possibly configuring Dragon to bring Butch and Sonny home, and ultimately, them making the decision to do so.
But as a reporter, you needed your witnesses to come back to Earth. And it sounds like when they did come back recently, you got to talk to Butch Wilmore a little bit more, I think, than anyone else. Can you tell us what you learned from talking to him that day?
Yeah, so it had been 9 months, right, since they'd had some on-orbit press conferences. Those are always pretty stiff affairs because you're a reporter, you've got like 20 minutes with the astronauts, so there's like 15 reporters, so you ask a question, they respond, and then they move on. It's not in depth. So Butch and Sonny came back to Earth. They had a press conference at Johnson Space Center, and then they broke out into one-on-one interviews with reporters, so where you can go a little bit deeper. And again, those were only 10 minutes, but I was Butch's last interview of the day here in Houston, Texas, and he and I had known each other a little bit because I've been covering the space agency for a long time. I actually went to his launch from Kazakhstan back in 2014. And so he decided to open up to me. So we didn't talk for 10 minutes, we talked for 30 minutes. And he was the pilot at the controls of Starliner. And so he told me the whole story of what turned out to be a really harrowing ride up to the space station.
And if people want to read that story, they should go to Ars Technica, where you report on it brilliantly. We kind of covered a little bit. And in the one little paragraph we covered, it just sounded like Butch was really angry. That's the takeaway I got. I'll just say that personally.
Worried. I mean, when he was on the ship, he was definitely worried.
Yeah. I guess what I was thinking is, you're a mission commander, you must train for this kind of stuff, and you must have a joystick in his hand, and when things go wrong, you just kind of, make it work, and eventually you'll bump into the ISS. Like, what's the big deal here? Why was he so worried?
Well, I think the main concern was that, we talked earlier about it depends on where those 5 thruster failures were. It turned out that they were concentrated in kind of one pod and one orientation. So he was down to a single point failure where if one more thruster had failed, he would have lost control of the vehicle. So then all of a sudden you're adrift in space. And I think the real tension for them is they were kind of limping along, a couple hundred feet from the space station. And it was like right there, it was close. And so they felt like it was really important to dock there because Butch and Sonny both told me that they felt if they had to abort the docking attempt. And by the way, NASA had to break its own flight rules to allow them to dock based upon the condition Starliner was in, which is pretty dramatic in and of itself. But if they had to abort, they didn't think they would be able to sort of align themselves safely for a deorbit burn and to come back to Earth safely. So it really turned out to be much more of a life and death situation than I think any of us on the ground realized. And certainly NASA and Boeing weren't talking like that.
So, I mean,
wait, what does that mean in English? Wait a minute. If they didn't dock, what would have happened?
So if they didn't dock from the space station, that's fine. but then they got to come back to Earth. And to do that, now the main propulsion system, which does the deorbit burn, again, that's functioning fine. But you've got to orient the spacecraft properly before that burn and just after that burn, so you enter Earth's atmosphere in A, the right place, and B, in the right orientation. Because if you're not, I mean, there's only one side of the spacecraft that has a heat shield on it, right? So you want to make sure that side's down.
Okay, so they're losing thrusters left and right. If they don't dock with the space station, then they're going to have to try and do a deorbit burn with that. Again, there's the single point failure. If one thruster goes, they're going to lose control of the spacecraft. There's many different points here. So let's say they don't dock and they decide that they're going to go with an abort. And this is all hypothetical, but so they're going to try and, basically point roughly retrograde. They're going to try and get where they want to be landing, because you can land. I mean, once you're in orbit, where you land is very vast distances, depending on when you deorbit, what your inclination is. All sorts of different stuff can put you in the middle of an ocean. It can put you in the middle of an unfriendly country. It can put, somewhere where your spacecraft is not supposed to land, because this is a water landing.
It's designed to land in the desert on land.
Okay, so it's a land.
Oh, so there's even less to hit correctly.
Yes.
to 1/3 land, 2/3 water. If they were to turn around and then the thruster goes and they start tumbling, I mean, was that what would essentially start to happen? Is they would tumble, or they would basically not be able to point, or it would just take forever to point in the right direction?
Right. So it was conceivably that's what could have happened. Yes, that they would have been in a not quite the orbit that they wanted to be in, and then they would have started to tumble. Now they could have tried some things to get those thrusters back, and that's not to jump too far ahead, but ultimately they did recover 2 thrusters before the 5th one failed. And if they hadn't gotten those back, then Butch would have lost control of the vehicle. They could have been tumbling. Yeah.
So this is why NASA kind of broke their own rules to allow them to really try and get to the ISS.
Yeah. He and Sonny had talked about it, that like the station was right there. They felt it was a safe haven, and both of them felt very strongly about that, regardless of what NASA ultimately was going to decide.
Now, I think that many people are familiar with some of the space emergencies that have happened before. Many of them are quick and fiery. Many of them are an explosion and the crew is lost and that was it, right? Like with Challenger and stuff like that. We haven't had too many in-orbit emergencies. I think the most famous, of course, is like Apollo 13, where you're going to have astronauts who are on board, maybe even having communication with Earth, and there's a problem, and if they don't solve the problem, then they're going to die. They're very uncommon. That's why we have the movie Apollo 13, and we don't really talk about some of the Russian disasters. This could have been, like, really, really bad.
Yeah, a huge setback.
Oh, there's no question. Like absolutely. It was on a hair's breadth of being within a disaster. Like, if another thruster goes down in the wrong place, they don't have control of Starliner. And we did not know that, publicly until a couple of weeks ago.
Until you talked to Butch.
Until Butch talked to me. He was the one who made the decision to share his...
It's a two-way street, and into his launch in Kazakhstan, so I'm sure that's part of why he felt comfortable talking to you. He talked to lots of other journalists that day.
Yeah.
You're a reporter. You're in a lot of these conversations. Have a lot of these questions been asked, or was this kind of just an out-of-the-blue occurrence?
So again, I think there hadn't been a lot of access to Butch and Sonny up until this point. Like, they had just gotten back to Earth. And again, when they're in space, their on-the-record interaction with journalists is very filtered. And I think when they got back to Earth, the things most people want to know about is, well, you had to spend 9 months in space. You're only expecting 8 days. How was that? And Elon Musk says that President Trump told to bring you back and you're only left up there because of the incompetence of the Biden administration. Is that the truth? And so those were the kind of questions that were floating around. And well, first of all, I wasn't really interested in the longevity question, because astronauts spend 9 months in space quite often now these days. And the political stuff, Butch and Sonny really couldn't answer that directly. They're just not going to do that. So I was, as I say, my strategy going into talking to both Butch and Sonny was trying to find out what it was like inside the spacecraft. Because again, we hadn't really had their perspective on all that before. From Boeing, we'd had a very sanitized account. From NASA, they said, well, these thrusters failed. But again, it was sort of a very clinical discussion. It wasn't like the astronauts were like really, nervous.
I mean, I get that things can fail, and I get that this is a new thing they had to test. But I kind of thought by the time you get to humans being in it, the number of things that could fail, or the chances of them failing, was so slim. And especially since we've kind of gotten to watch the whole SpaceX Crew Dragon program, And they were originally going to land with thrusters, and then they decided they had to go with parachutes because they didn't have time, blah, blah. But I just didn't think that Boeing, this company that had been doing this stuff for a long time, I just didn't think that we would get a spacecraft that was going to fail like that. Did that surprise everybody?
Not really, at least me. I think some of my colleagues as well. Because, we saw the first Starliner flight in December 2020, where they had all of these cascading software failures. And that spacecraft was almost lost right after launch. It was almost lost right before reentry. Now, again, there were not people on it. But that initial test flight had so many problems, NASA said, look, you got to fly a second test flight. So that's why we had the second test flight a couple of years later where there were the thruster issues. Now, interestingly, the thruster issues didn't really occur on the first test flight back in 2020 because that spacecraft was never allowed to get close to the International Space Station. Second time, it actually did fly up and dock with the space station. But the problem for Boeing is that with the commercial crew programs, this was NASA's program after the space shuttle to pay private companies to provide transportation services to the International Space Station. That was a fixed price program. That means you bid a certain amount of money to NASA, and NASA said, okay, we're going to give you, in Boeing's case, $4.2 billion, and that's going to buy us a certain amount of flights to the International Space Station. You have the design decision over the spacecraft. SpaceX was the other bidder, of course, in commercial crew successful. Now, for SpaceX, they had been operating in a fixed price environment almost from the beginning of the company. For Boeing, this is entirely new. Right? They had been used to operating in an environment where the government paid all of their expenses plus a fee. It's called a cost plus contracting structure. And so for their management, it was very new and challenging to operate under those kinds of things, because then you have to make some pretty hard decisions of, okay, do we really want to put these extra engineers to solve this problem, or is it good enough? Do we really want to run this extra series of tests, or do we want to sort of take some of that risk? And that's actually what happened with their first test flight in 2020. They didn't run what's called an end-to-end software test of basically the spacecraft from all the way from launch to docking to landing on Earth. And because they didn't run that integrated test, that's why they didn't discover the errors in their software. So again, Boeing was really struggling with how to operate in this fixed price environment. And so, yeah, I guess it didn't surprise me that we saw technical challenges.
Wow. Is this going to be your next book?
No, I don't think so. I think first of all, to write a really good book, you have to talk to all the people that did it. And I've been pretty critical of Boeing over the years, particularly with the Space Launch System rocket, which is, huge, costly, and pretty much unnecessary. So I don't think people at Boeing would be lining up to tell me their stories.
I think it's fine to tell the story of, in this case, so far, the victor, which is SpaceX. And again, just a plug. You're not paying me to say this, but I love both of your books. Both Liftoff and Reentry are both fantastic. If you are watching this, if you watch this far, to the viewers, if you've watched this far and you haven't read those books, just do yourself a favor, order them both and read them because they're fabulous.
Yeah.
So talk to me about, I get that on the International Space Station, Butch and Suni aren't going to say anything too racy, but they had a whole day of them. They've come back to Earth. They're doing the whole press junket. Why do you think that it was your interview with Butch that you finally got I don't want to say the truth, because obviously we knew that there were some failures, but why do you think we actually got the real meat of the story?
I think there's a couple of plausible reasons. One is that it was the last interview of the day, so he didn't have someone there saying, oh, we got to go because so-and-so is up next. So he knew he could go over without sort of running into that kind of a firewall with the public affairs person. Now, she was still kind of gesticulating off to the side saying, we got to wrap it up, but he kept going. I think two, again, sort of, I've been writing about space for a couple of decades. Most people at Johnson Space Center, and certainly in the astronaut office, know of my work if they don't know me. Some probably like it, some don't appreciate it. But, I try to cover the space industry honestly and tell the story of what's really happening. And again, there was that connection. When you travel to Russia to see a launch into Kazakhstan, the whole family is right there with you. Like his whole family that went to see the launch is on the same airplane from Moscow down to Baikonur in Kazakhstan. And then you're at the event, so you see them. And so Butch and I didn't have we're not going to drink beers every month or something at a local pub, but he knows of me and I think respects my work and knows that someone's going to write about this. It's going to be, I'm a good person because I'm knowledgeable about the subject matter and I care enough to get the story right. And I'm not just looking for a quick soundbite.
And I mean, I want to thank you for being that guy, because sometimes there is just one. And in this case, it was you. And I think it's pretty powerful that that's the case. I'm just amazed that we were able to get this story and then it didn't come out, you know, a
Years
year
later.
from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now. You know, it seems like it could have been something that he could have been stifled with. It seems like it's definitely a story that Boeing does not want to come out.
Frankly, I was really surprised too. You know, sometimes you're sitting there in the interview and you're trying to process all of the things you're hearing while sort of staying on top of things to be able to answer, you know, ask an honest or a good question next. But I certainly wasn't expecting him to go as deep as he did and really talk a lot about how he had done so much training, talking about going in at like 5:30 a.m. on the weekend after the trainer got off a volunteer firefighting shift to do work. And he's like, in all of that training, we never had simmed for 5 thruster failures. Like they were truly in a situation that they had not expected to encounter. And it was just really a hairy situation. And no, I certainly didn't expect him to go that deep with me, but he would not have done it unless he wanted to tell that story. Like he clearly had been sitting on some frustrations, right? And wanted the world to know.
I just always thought, because we're in a fairly low Earth orbit, that there was many ways to save astronauts. I didn't really understand till this unfolded that there isn't, and that, for instance, the reason why I think NASA doesn't want you to get close to the space station unless everything's going to be perfect is risking the people in the space station and the space station, right? Because I assume if you bump into the space station, that's not good.
That's exactly right. Like NASA has very strict rules. It has called a keep out sphere around the space station. You're only allowed to enter that if like everything's good between your communications with the ground, communications between the space station. You sort of have a good lock on ISS visually, and your LiDARs and everything are working distances to determine distances. And so, yeah, like usually it's like protecting the crew on board the space station as much or more as it is the astronauts. In this case, you know, NASA did have lots of ways to take care of Butch and Sonny once they got to the space station. And we saw that, right? They could have come home on Starliner. They could have come home. They could have all kind of crammed into a Dragon, and 6 of them could have come back. They opted for a different solution, but they had to get there first. And I think that's the piece we didn't really realize, is that if Butch and Sonny had not docked to the space station, how much peril they really were in.
Another piece that came out from your reporting is that going up to the space station, I think normally Starliner would have had 4 astronauts on it. That's what it was designed to have, but this was a 2-person mission. I recall hearing that they were cold.
So there's no thermostat?
You can't just turn up the thermostat a little bit?
I don't think you have a Nest thermostat on the wall of Starliner. No, they both he and Sonny was actually the first to tell me that like they got super cold that first night in space. And they think maybe it's because there were just 2 of them instead of 4, but then someone after I wrote that did the calculations, apparently said if there's 4 people, it still would have been really cold. So it's like an issue with Starliner. But yeah, they said they both put their spacesuits on, they put their boots on, and they were like huddling, trying to stay warm that first.
This sounds like 60s problems. Like it doesn't, I just thought by now this would be
Soviet. I mean, it's a kind of, it's like when Valentina, landed on Russia and, had to like fight her way back home or something.
Well, if you think about it, one parallel that strikes me is Neil Armstrong with the Gemini program when he flew up and the vehicle he was piloting started spinning out of control. Now, his thrusters weren't failing. This was a separate problem that caused that. But he's sitting there spinning around, and like as G-forces go, like he's close to blacking out. His pilot is already sitting behind him, is already blacked out. And like he had sort of the presence of mind to sort of figure out how to stabilize the Gemini spacecraft and save their lives. I mean, I think that was the point at which everyone at NASA realized this is really a cool customer. And if we want someone at the controls of the first lunar landing, it's probably this guy. But similarly, like Butch is like a hero for keeping that mission on track.
Well, yeah, can we just go back to my silly statement of like that you can just pilot this thing with the joystick? Because I feel like after playing video games, we all think, like Jesse said, that we can do it. But when you were reporting on what Butch told you about, there's so many degrees of freedom. Like I only think of left and right, but that's because I'm on Earth. Like he had, 6 that he had to worry about. And then there's things, orbital mechanics that I don't claim to understand, that, if you're too high, you're actually going too slow or whatever it is, that he had to actually be doing all of this physics in his head. Can you just talk about that for a second? Because that must have freaked him out.
What he's trying to figure out as he's piloting the spacecraft, again, through the 6 degrees of freedom, and he's losing what he called 6 DOF control, because if you lose one of those degrees of freedom in terms of the movement, then you can't control the movement of the spacecraft in that direction, which obviously is critical. He's sort of trying to calculate, like, okay, if these two thrusters are out here and this thruster's out here, and we're so many meters below the space station, and we're drifting away, getting closer, can I account for that with what thrusters I have available? And like, he's got controls and everything like that, but he's trying to work it all out in his head so he can make sure when it instinctually as a pilot, you have to take that joystick and fly, he knows what to do. About the limit of my piloting skills is Super Mario Kart.
And I mean, he was losing thrust because he's losing thrusters, which means that now instead of the spacecraft behaving the way that you'd expect it to, it's suddenly you've lost a whole bunch of control, and it has to basically, almost like traction control, it has to like throttle itself, the other thrusters, because now you're just relying on this one to do its job.
Well, and he's also probably wondering what's going on, because I think at one point he said, like, am I going to lose comms next? Like, is this just all going to fall apart on me here?
Well, yeah, that's true. Like if the spacecraft starts drifting or tumbling a little bit, then you might lose communications either with the station or the ground. I think probably the biggest concern was that you lose one thruster, you lose two, you lose three, you lose four. You start to wonder, where does this stop, right? Like, is this a cascade failure where more are going down? So I think there was the uncertainty and concern that they might just continue to lose thrusters along the way, which that certainly weighed them. And then yet on top of all that, like apparently as the thrusters come on and off, it makes this pretty loud sound inside the spacecraft. So I think that probably just added to the eeriness of the whole experience.
It seems like it would make a good movie, an Apollo 13 style movie, where you'd have the people on the ground who could basically explain to the audience what's going on and how stressful it is. But
and Starliner was, I think the audience might not know this, but Starliner was supposed to come online much sooner, right? This was supposed to be it was supposed to almost be doing, Dragon and then Starliner, Dragon, then Starliner, right?
Yeah, I mean, initially they were both supposed to be ready by 2017. No one really thought that was reasonable. They was hoping for 2019. And so SpaceX comes along and does its first uncrewed test flight in 2019, which is great. But then the spacecraft blew up on the ground, right, in some subsequent testing. And so they were set back. And then Boeing came along. It was the end of 2019 when they did their first test flight. And they had all those problems. So like in 2019, SpaceX and Boeing were pretty close. And then SpaceX recovered from that. They did their first test flight with Bob and Doug in the middle of 2020. And then they've just flown, I think they've just done Crew 9. They're preparing for Crew 10. So that's like 10 operational space station missions, and Boeing has yet to do one. Boeing just sort of fell further and further behind as they ran into technical problems with Starliner.
Wow. Do you think Boeing is going to be able to recover from this? I mean, because I just heard that, SpaceX just got a huge chunk of the latest contracts. Is this basically going to just keep pushing Boeing further and further behind?
So the future of Boeing in space is really a good one and pretty up uncertain, because they've had three main contracts. Number one, they've had the contract to operate the International Space Station. It's about $1 billion a year. And they've done a fine job. I think that space station contract is excellent, but space station is going to more than likely not be retiring in 5 years from now. So that contract then goes away. Boeing has the big Space Launch System rocket contractor. They build the core stage and are responsible for some of the integration activities. And so that's a major portion of their space activities. And I'm pretty confident that rocket is going to go away over the next two flights. So probably again, by 2030, the Space Launch System rocket probably won't exist anymore. I think what will happen is not certain. And then you got Starliner. And they've now lost about $2 billion on the fixed price contract. We talked about the challenges of managing that contract. Well, these setbacks and the fact that they're not getting funding from operational missions has really set them back as well. Initially you thought maybe they were going to fly 10 or 12 Starliner flights to the International Space Station. I think at this point now, the maximum number we're looking at is maybe 2 to 4 Starliner missions with people to the ISS. And so that contract really is shrunk down now as well. And so what is the future of Boeing in space? I mean, I don't know. The one program they're really operating well, the space station, is going away for sure. And so I think it's very uncertain.
Eric, thank you so much for being with us today. People, you should go follow Eric on X, read his articles on Ars Technica, and definitely, as Jesse said, go get Liftoff and Reentry. I think the two best books on space that have come out in many, many years.
Well, guys, Dak and Jesse, thank you so much. You've been very kind.
Thank you to Novium for sponsoring today's episode.
Whether you're a science or space enthusiast or simply someone who enjoys having beautiful objects, the Hover Pen is the ultimate gift idea.
Use our code NYK or hit the link in the description to get 10% off all Hover Pens. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. Thank you, Eric, for being here. And we'll see you guys Thursday. Now you know.